Thank you, Joel. As Joel said, I'm going to do a balanced history. And actually, I won't draw any conclusions. I'll just give you facts that go back. And it's important to understand that, I think, to understand the current conflict. First, let's talk about the Ossetian people and also the Georgians. Ossetians are Iranian-based. They speak a derivative of Persian language. They came down about the 13th century. The Mongol hordes invaded Russia. And you can see on the map behind me Volgograd and Rostov. And in fact, that's the Don River. That's where they lived. To live there would have meant fighting the Mongols, so they moved south until they came to the border of Georgia, where they met the Georgians, who basically repulsed them, and they wound up in now what is North Ossetia. And so that occurred in the 13th century. The Georgians had been in Georgia for 5,000 years. They've had a civilization. There's actually gold pieces that were made in their mints 5,000 years ago. Many of you probably heard that the story Jason and the Argonauts is true, that there actually was a golden fleece. You take the sheep skin and put it in the rivers in Seine gold. And there was so much gold in the rivers it would stick, and there literally was a golden fleece. And so Georgians speak a Georgian language, which is not a derivative of anything. It's an absolutely unique language, and it's totally incomprehensible. The best scholar I know who speaks 7 languages from the region says it's totally incomprehensible to him. They use a separate alphabet, and the tonal basis, the sound basis, is different than any other. So it's safe to say Ossetians and Georgians who don't speak Russian cannot communicate with each other. Religion's not really an issue in South Ossetia. They're all Orthodox. Georgians are Orthodox, and Ossetians are Orthodox. Now, there are Muslim Ossetians, about 30% of the country. Most of those live in the north. If you notice, if you look at the map behind me, you see above Georgia, in the southern part of the Russian Federation, you see Chechnya up there. I doubt you can see it well. And Dagestan, which are both Muslim countries. And in between is another place called Ingustan, which is another Muslim country. And in fact, that area has stayed Muslim. After the 13th century, things just kind of perked along until World War I. And at that point, the Russians had taken over Georgia. In about 1800, it became part of the Tsar's Georgia, and in fact was a separate state, which included South Ossetia. It also included 2 other states, Abkhazia, which is on the northeastern part of Georgia, and Ajaria, which is in the northwestern part of Georgia is Abkhazia, and Ajaria is in the southwestern part. And those are 3 separate oblasts, and they have been trying to get independent of Georgia from about that point. But they have always territorially been included in Georgia. So in World War I, by that time, Ossetians had leaked down from North Ossetia till the area which is now called South Ossetia was about 70% Ossetian, 25% Georgian, and 5% Russians, Armenians, and others. After the Bolshevik Revolution during World War I, Georgia declared its independence, including those oblasts, and in fact was independent for 3 years. Basically, the Bolsheviks came in, the Soviet army, and captured Georgia. And in fact, the Ossetians aided and abetted because they had their natural roots were north to North Ossetia, which had always been part of Russia. So that takes you through World War I. Things settle back down. By 1922, Georgia becomes one of the SSRs in the USSR. And in fact, people there, Ossetians and Georgians, start intermarrying. And in fact, it's pretty peaceful until about 1988-89. At the fall of the Soviet Union, in that era, right at the late part, nationalist tendencies became very strong in all of the Soviet Union. And in fact, Georgia were among the most ardent nationalists. So were the South Ossetians, or the Ossetians, because they wanted independence as well. And in fact, in 1989, when Georgia was still an SSR, it established Georgian as the principal language of Georgia, which included South Ossetia. What that meant is that the Russian and Ossetian-speaking Ossetians couldn't hold public jobs. So in all of the towns and all of the area, all of those jobs were lost. And they, as you can imagine, were not too happy about that. Secondly, after that happened, South Ossetia asked the Soviet Union to declare it a completely independent SSR and join the Soviet Union outside of Georgia, which they ignored. Finally, that started the escalation into violence, as you can imagine, and local violence primarily. But then in 1990, Georgia, the Independence Party in South Ossetia, was a regional party, and as a move basically to stop that group and the Abkhazians, Georgia outlawed regional parties. At that point, South Ossetia self-declared itself to be an SSR, a completely independent of Georgia and part of the Soviet Union. They didn't bother to ask the Soviet Union at that point. That was met by the Georgians, who then abolished their independent status as an oblast, and basically all hell broke loose. In 1990, at the end of the year, there was tremendous violence, and at the end of that year, a man who lived in infamy named Zviad Gamskurdia was elected the president of Georgia. He had been a college professor. He had spent most of his 30 years working with Amnesty International to establish them. He had been a freedom fighter for Georgia, and in fact, he was a very good college professor and one of the worst rulers in history. And he basically wound up plunging Georgia into civil war to try and get him removed. The violence in Ossetia increased dramatically as well. And by the middle of that year, there was a complete revolution. The armies fought, and Georgia was in full civil war. And effectively, that was won when he abdicated, and Everett Shevardnadze, the old Russian foreign minister, came back to Georgia to take over as the government. The first thing he did the following year was the Russians had issued a soft ultimatum which said, if you don't stop invading Ossetia, we will go to war with you. And he, of course, knew all the leaders in Moscow, and he indeed accepted a ceasefire which included Russian peacekeepers. Being in South Ossetia, there were also Ossetian and Georgian peacekeepers at the same time. The violence finally came to an end, and the result of that in South Ossetia is that 100,000 Ossetians in Georgia and South Ossetia moved north and went back into what is now North Ossetia and the rest of the provinces in that part of Georgia. 20,000 Georgians moved out of South Ossetia and went back into Georgia, and the country basically halved its population. Now, this region had typically been 70%, but it moved into 75% Ossetian, and almost no one else was left but a few Georgians, and so the region continued to be Ossetian. There was a mandate, a referendum held in South Ossetia, which actually 95% of the people who voted, including Georgians, wanted to become free of Georgia. The entire world, including the Russian Federation, said, no, we're not going to do that. But they did set up an independent border, and in effect, it was an independent state that no one recognized officially. But in fact, it had its own border perimeter, Georgians on one side, Ossetians on the other. They had their own foreign ministry, etc. To describe the state of the two countries, though, Georgia was in wretched shape. It was run by militia. It was barely controlled outside of Tbilisi. It was in bad shape. And South Ossetia is in worse shape. The official income in South Ossetia is $250 per person per year, which is unbelievably low. And of course, that means it's one of the criminal havens of the world. Counterfeiting is one of the most sophisticated counterfeiting and smuggling havens in the world, and so is run somewhat by warlords. 1992 ends, and we move forward again now to 2004. Things settle back down. In 2004, in January, Mikhail Saakashvili is elected the president of Georgia. And one of the first accomplishments he makes is that he goes south to Ajaria, which is 93% ethnic Georgian, and cuts a deal with them where they reintegrate with the Republic of Georgia. And that's a tremendous triumph, and I remember that very well. And so then he says, now we're going to do that with South Ossetia. What I didn't understand at the time, of course, is 93% Georgian meant it wasn't that hard to do. It also doesn't share a border with Russia. Ossetia is a completely different issue. Violence predictably starts kicking back up. Another important event in the 2000s is that the pipeline from Baku to the Black Sea through Georgia is announced and starts construction. And that's a pipeline that will allow the Azeris to ship their oil into the West without going through Russia. In 2006, there are two major events that affect the relationship between Georgia, South Ossetia, and then Russia on the other side. The first is that in early 2006, Saakashvili arranges for 4 Russian military officers to be arrested as spies, which is a complete breach of protocol. And basically at that point, Putin started taking Saakashvili as a personal affront, which is different than it had been. They'd always had tense relationships, but it became a personal affront. And the second thing happened about 3 months later in the summer, when the EU announced that the only solution, and the one they found for Kosovo and Serbia, was to separate Kosovo from Serbia and create a separate state to stop the ethnic hatred that was there. That was a landmark decision and precedent, because that's the first time in modern history that a country that had not been an independent country had been created. In other words, when the Baltic states succeeded from Russia, they had always been independent countries. And so it was much different, for instance, when Montenegro or Serbia, when those were independent states. But this is a big difference. And the Russians pointed this out and said, we think this is also the solution for South Ossetia and Abkhazia. Javier Solana, in a Radio Free Europe article, responded and said that he could see why they would think it was a precedent. He hoped it did not. Excuse me, I didn't realize it was going to go off right now. Nobody there I need to talk to. My apologies.
Tell Mr. Putin hello.
So in 2006, the Russians, when their response, they said that the exact parallel position between South Ossetia and, oh, by the way, it was their soldiers being shot, and they were the one paying for all this, and they were tired of it, and they wanted to be able to do what the Western world had said was the right thing to do in Kosovo, which, by the way, they argued vehemently against. Solana answered them and said, we hope you won't take that as a precedent, but we understand. So the pipeline keeps going, and then you get to 2007, a year later. And Kosovo does declare and celebrates its independence. The Russian Foreign Ministry issues a statement which said, Russia will seek for South Ossetia and for Abkhazia to become independent states. And that basically is the short history I promised to give.
Okay, very good job. That's to crowd that in, but a very enlightening thing. So right away you see there are two sides, and instinctively you know there are two sides. So now, General Porthos, please join us, and we know the state of the military. Welcome.
Thank you, Joel. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with such an august group of people. I'd like to take a moment of personal privilege to speak to those in the International Business Fellows to let you know that I was a founding member of this organization. It took place in 1972 in a bar. You'll be pleased to know in the Ladbroke Hotel in London, we had such a wonderful time, we thought it should be continued, and it's grown far beyond our wildest expectations. Well, thank you, Meade. That was an excellent summary, and I'd like to try to take it from there. As Meade pointed out, Saakashvili was successful in reincorporating Georgia, essentially without incident. Abkhazia and South Ossetia are fundamentally different. Around the middle of the decade of the 90s, the United States began to engage Georgia militarily as well as diplomatically. The major component of the military engagement was actually the Georgia National Guard. We began a partnership with the Ministry of Defense. It involved some of our people on the ground, permanent party in Georgia, living there, working with the ministry. Basically, it was a very soft diplomatic kind of engagement, no hard military training, no weapons transfer of any sort. That moved along until the Rose Revolution, in which Saakashvili became the president and Edward Shevardnadze was bloodlessly ousted. After that, the intensity of the engagement ramped up quickly. The grand strategy, at least on the part of the Georgians, was that they would eventually be admitted to NATO. They have worked assiduously to that goal, and with some success. Not there yet, but they are well on the way. A major component of that was basically retooling and re-equipping and retraining the Georgian military, which to that point was a Soviet model style of leadership and staff organization. The equipment was Soviet material left over from pre-revolutionary days, generally in extremely bad shape. The United States Marine Corps, the United States Army played a major role in that successfully. so that the Georgian army, or the Georgian military, became a NATO-compatible, functioning, effective military organization. Now, you might legitimately inquire whether or why would Georgia, a country the size of Georgia, which is approximately the size of South Carolina, with a population of, what is it, David, 4 million people or something like that, would want an army? A legitimate question. There are no enemies around Georgia except to the north. Armenia and Azerbaijan essentially have no military forces. Turkey is a very warm ally and historically has been. The only potentially adverse party is to the north, meaning Russia. Is it reasonable to expect that Georgia could withstand a military engagement with Russia? No. So why should Georgia have an army? Well, the answer is Georgia very quickly became and now is an exporter of military combat capability. As we speak, the Republic of Georgia is the third largest military contingent in both Iraq and Afghanistan, not as a percentage of population, but in absolute numbers of people. This is a key, in their mind, and I believe correctly so, to admission to NATO. So that then brings us to the events of this summer. I think you have to go back before that, and my dates are not a little hazy in my mind, but you will recall in the spring there were two separate incidents in which Soviet aircraft, it was not a mistaken incursion, it was plainly a deliberate and far-reaching incursion into Georgian airspace. I believe it was on the second incursion that the aircraft actually either dropped or lost a bomb of some description which landed in a field and blew up. But nevertheless, both of these were pretty clearly intentional, egregious invasion of Georgians' sovereign airspace. The Georgians protested loudly. They fully documented their case, all to no avail. The hostility, the personal hostility between President Saakashvili and President Putin continues to percolate along. Then later in the spring, the Russian army begins holding major military exercises just north of the Rocky Tunnel. That's R-O-K-I. The Rocky Tunnel is essentially the single mode of transportation and overland communication between North and South Ossetia, a tunnel that runs through the greater Caucasus Mountains. The Russians are staging large amounts of equipment, men, material for this exercise. The exercise is over. In retrospect, what many of us suspect was it was at that time that a good bit of that material actually moved through the tunnel into South Ossetia. Early in August and leading up to this time, there are continuous confrontations, various types of aggravation back and forth across the border between Georgians and the South Ossetians. At some point, there's an exchange of artillery fire, which is fairly accurate and fairly deadly. At that point, Georgian forces actually moved north into South Ossetia. They encountered something they did not expect, and that was a very, very sizable Russian force, including a considerable amount of dug-in heavy armor, meaning tanks and armored vehicles. It was a very short and unhappy experience. The Georgians were quickly forced to withdraw. The reports of bloodshed and casualties are all over the board, from a low of a few scores of people to many thousands. And I don't think the truth will be known for some time, if ever. But suffice to say, the Georgians withdrew, essentially sued for peace. A peace arrangement was negotiated by President Sarkozy of France. The Russians, actually in violation of that agreement, which they agreed in principle, but they did not completely implement it. They did not withdraw within the zones of conflict, that is, within South Ossetia and Abkhazia. They remained outside for a while. Essentially, today, they have now drawn back within the borders of South Ossetia and Abkhazia. And I mentioned Abkhazia because that was actually a little-known second front in this war. As soon as the hostility or conflict, as soon as the hostilities erupted in South Ossetia, the Abkhaz, who are likewise ethnically distinct from the Georgians and are likewise a vassal entity of the Russian government, began to push eastward from the Black Sea coast into a place called the Kadori Gorge, a disputed area between Georgia and Abkhazia. They have reoccupied the Kadori Gorge and driven out the Georgian forces as well as the Georgian civilians who were living there. A thumbnail of the military, it was entirely, almost entirely a ground activity, what we would call light infantry, although there was some armor involved. There was no air-to-air engagement. The Georgian military has very limited air assets. What they do have are mostly helicopters, which were trained primarily by the Georgian National Guard. The Georgian air defense, on the other hand, proved to be extremely effective. The unofficial reports are that as many as 20 Soviet aircraft were brought down, including a backfire bomber, which is their equivalent of our B-1 bomber, a very large strategic resource. I guess I would conclude by moving from the purely military to the strategic question, if I may. I'm not sure I'm exceeding my license here, but I guess the question is, who won this? From a military standpoint, there's no question the Russians prevailed. The question is, what did they get? They have now alienated clearly Western Europe, including particularly France, who attempted to broker the arrangement. Their European customers for gas and oil are now very nervous about the reliability of Russia as a source. Immediately after hostilities broke out, the Ukrainians offered up to the Americans the use of their radar resources as part of our defensive shield in Poland. The Czech Republic immediately agreed to the installation of U.S. military radar on their territory, and the Poles immediately agreed to the installation of the missile defense system. So the question is, what did the Russians get out of this? Strategically, I think probably not much. For the foreseeable future, however, I think it is clear that they will continue to maintain control, both militarily and politically, of Abkhazia and South Ossetia.
Any more?
Thanks very much. Well, the good news is that they told us that we had to cover whatever we started with. I think it was the invasion of the Mongols in 1240. So if you take that, and so it works out to all those centuries, and do that in 7 minutes times 3, I don't know what it works out to, but it's about a decade a second. So I'll move as fast as I can. But also, you can be relieved to know, since we do all have clocks and responsibilities later, that in fact we had 3 people, and I was so relieved that they'd taken 2/3 of my speech, and that was great, and good for you too. And then the general went into the last 3 or 4 sentences and took the last third. So I can just have a good time and analyze all the presentation. As you look at this thing, I did want to say certainly thank you on behalf of the Southern Center for International Studies, and to thank the Southern Center for International Studies. I'm very honored to be the new president of the organization. The founders, Peter White, Julia White, Cedric Suzman, have worked very hard for 4 decades in this city to do what all the organizations represented in this room want to do, which is to create a forum, create a platform where we all, as citizens, as corporations, as universities, as associations,
and any other communities you want to identify with, that we can learn, that we can be both discerning, skeptical, as well as really thorough in our understanding of these very complicated subjects. And I certainly am honored to be part of a legacy of an organization that has spent the last 4 decades in this city doing just that. And thank you for that. They said in the introduction that I was in Moscow. That is true. I guess revealing why I was there is probably maybe interesting to you. I wear 2 hats, actually. I'm a professor in the Robinson College of Business at Georgia State University, with my principal responsibility being to work on joint programs between the Southern Center and Georgia State as we move forward with a strategy that involves putting together forums and briefings and so forth, traditional things the Southern Center has done, but some of these new programs will be oriented toward the economic development and business interest of the city. But my specific duty right now for Georgia State is over the last 6 months, I've been to Russia 4 times. Georgia State has an agreement with Moscow State University, the premier university in Russia. It is the Harvard of Russia. The Department of Economics is a very famous department in that university. And our objective is to develop an executive MBA or executive leaders program, which will involve a Master of Science in Management from Moscow State and an MBA from Georgia State. It's a very daunting, challenging thing, and after August the 7th, even more challenging for me to try to see how we can work through this and continue the dialogue with our colleagues there, both in the business community as well as the university community. So that's why I was there. That's why I'm still there. The representation from Moscow State was here this week in Atlanta. We were trying to see what did these events, how would that impact our efforts. The word that I'm getting informally from both our government as well as the Russian government, I think this is not public, well, at least to me, is that both governments are encouraging us to continue. I mean, any kind of business interaction, we need to stay engaged, no matter what the political and diplomatic and even military developments may be. That could change, of course, but at least at the moment, we're going to try to stay engaged. The level of conversation about everything you've heard, is to me, it's really quite remarkable. The level of the discourse. We have had the president of Russia refer to the president of a sovereign country, the Republic of Georgia, as a political corpse. We've had the Secretary of Defense refer to the whole engagement and the responses, especially of the Russians, as like someone, and I assume meaning a baby, throwing food on the floor. We've certainly had the conversation that has come out in the last 2 days by the Venezuelan chief of state and president, who says, all of these developments of bringing ships and planes to Venezuela should make the Yankees squeal. And then finally, I think one of the great statements that we've heard from our spokes department of our own State Department said, in respect to those 4 ships or ships that are going to go to Venezuela, the comment was, well, at least we know they have 4 ships that can make it that far. It's a clever remark, but all of these things are of at least some concern, just that we make sure we are always going to have anybody on any side of political engagement going to make comments sometimes like this. But in my experience of dealing with Russia and with international affairs for at least since the 1960s when I was in the military and through my whole career, this is one of the most serious situations that I think we can face, because there are so many unknowns, so many things that we don't fully understand about the motivations and of course the complexities that have been outlined for you. Russia's reaction, I think I'll limit it to just the things that haven't been covered and things I observed. But maybe that'll be the most interesting thing of the various things I could say. Russia's reaction, first and foremost, was very clear. The first response was after the first day or two of just trying to get the information was actually one of great pride. The patriotic, nationalistic sentiment of Russia won't surprise you, that was really encouraged. A lot of people, even people I've known for a while, Russians were saying, well, this is just a statement that we're making that, you know, it's kind of Russia is back. Whatever the size and military capability of the adversary, namely the Republic of Georgia, from their point of view, it still is instructive to me that everywhere I went, while they were not overtly hostile to me, they were certainly proud of what Mr. Putin had done. They rallied behind him rather specifically and emphatically. The second thing was, it was very interesting being in the Radisson Hotel. I could get BBC and CNN on that Sunday night, Monday night, Tuesday night, through that week after the conflict started and was quickly over, but by all through that week, and then I could turn to the Russian channel and listen to that, and it was like two completely different stories. Very, very, very different representation of the events that would occur, as you could imagine. But it was quite wonderful for me to be able to see that and really see that from the Russian point of view. All of the things that were articulated before, this does go back a long, long way. There are a lot of complications here, but the Russians had their reasons that you've heard. That we don't have to agree with those, but I think there is some recognition that it's required that they do have some geostrategic and security issues from their point of view. If you look at that map, they don't have so many friends around that periphery. If you look from the Baltics all the way around, and if you look over the Arctic, what's on the other side of the Arctic from them, and then all the way around through China, mostly these are people historically and currently who are not overly enamored of the Russian bear or certainly of Russian dominance, other than what is obvious in terms of economic and other relationships. The result of the isolation, which was pointed out by the general, is real. It is real in the sense that clearly the whole international community, except for Venezuela and a couple of other folks, have not supported what the Russians did, and this affront to Georgian sovereignty and the whole principle of international law as the rest of the world understands it. The European Union certainly has stood up and been very strong initially in trying to work out a ceasefire. There's much disagreement, as you know, between the European community as well. But the upshot is Russia is on the pathway to isolation, again, diplomatically and physically, if they're not careful. Now, interestingly enough, our very, very talented Secretary of Defense, Gates, also said we have to be careful, too, not to get isolated by any overreaction or reaction to tactical things when we really have to look long-term strategic considerations. This thing is not just about ethnicity or about geography or about history. It's about all of those things, certainly. It's about energy. It's about the proximity of NATO forces to this country of Russia. It's about the history of 1991, or maybe you could argue, as the general did, a few years before in the history. But if you look at the development since the fall of the Soviet Union, we had the country essentially melt down in August of 1998. The country was essentially bankrupt. Their military was not taken seriously really anywhere. The whole country was in essential shambles in a lot of ways. The remarkable pathway, mostly because of the price of oil and gas, but a lot of very strong commitment by Mr. Putin has changed that picture over the last decade. And all of a sudden they are in a position to reassert their geostrategic interest and with some teeth to back that up. They mostly are concerned about their security interest, especially on their borders, and as Mr. Medvedev he'll go beyond the borders. Medvedev, in the last few days, has articulated the 5 principles. I'll sort of focus in and finish on this, then we can have a conversation. He articulated 5 principles of their future engagement in the world. He set out the Russian principles in which they're going to engage. They are interesting because Dr. Heller and other specialists on European history, people who have studied these places for a long time, it almost sounds like previous languages from previous time. Number 1, International law is the basis of all relationships. This is a comment and a statement. This is Mr. Medvedev, President of Russia, saying this. He is a lawyer, and he is very articulate, very, very lovely, beautiful Russian, too, by the way. And he states this as his first principle. He says it in almost every speech, and yet, as their political predecessors have done, they're willing to change or interpret international law to suit their own needs. We know this, but that's the first principle. Second, multipolar world, declaring that unipolarity is unacceptable, domination is permissible. This is probably one of the heart of what their response is that from the Russian point of view, the American dominance of the world scene, from their point of view, is unacceptable. They played an equal, or what they perceive to be an equal role for many, many decades under the Soviet regime. They believe that they can assert their strength due to their economic power and can play a different role, and asserting that America cannot be unipolar power anymore. This is Medvedev speaking. Third, he doesn't want the country to be isolated, and yet what some of their actions seem to be implying that that's where they're headed. The fourth principle, and this gets more to the heart of their foreign policy going forward, which is to protect the citizens, quote, wherever they are in our business community abroad. This is what gets the Ukrainians and all of the peripheral states, all of the stands, and the Caucasus countries very, very nervous indeed, because protecting the citizens was the reason they said they went into South Ossetia. They could use that in almost in any of these places where ethnic Russians reside. And they will certainly, that would be a premise for any actions that they may want to take, or at least implicit threats. 5, Russia, like other countries, has regions where it has privileged interest. The second, absolutely heart-chilling statement, if you look at the previous Soviet republics. I can't imagine, if you hear that statement, that you're not greatly concerned. Especially, he says, with our close neighbors, including our border regions. We have privileged interest, an assertion of privileged power, privileged influence in the region. The final thing I would say, and there's so much to talk, and maybe we can do this. The final thing is this. The Russian stock market this week has plummeted. For 2 days, it was not, as we say in the commodity business, almost limit down. But it started back in the spring because of a whole lot of reasons. The bank liquidity is of the major banks like VTB and others is in serious jeopardy, or at least in serious question. The government today has announced that both the sovereign funds and the central bank have taken and will take action to support both the banking system and the stock market. We haven't seen this kind of situation since August of 1998. And this is of great concern internally. I talk to Russia every morning to business people that I'm working with on this other project, and people are actually quite concerned. It proves the point that you may declare these things, you may become isolated, but you can't not be. As the Russian businessman told me early this morning, he said, when we are intertwined. The world is intertwined. And if I have any other thing, that the Russians must learn this too. The impact of international financial concerns, even crises, the movement of military forces today, the implicit and explicit threats that any political arrangements or pronouncements do are indeed intertwined with the rest of the world. I don't believe it is possible unless they're prepared to go back to some prehistoric state that the Russians would want to be isolated. Their whole country is based on an extraction economy. It is, in that respect, quite a primitive economy because they're basing everything on strategic metals, gas and oil, and some other things. And without that extraction and a worldwide customer base, I think they have very serious questions to ask about their foreign policy and how they're going to relate to the rest of the world. As for the United States, and this would be my question to the General and especially, as we look at positioning in the geostrategic realities, how do we engage with the Russians? Should we engage with them, and what would be the constructive things that we could have conversations about? You can quickly put on the list counter-terrorism. You can put on the list proliferation and non-proliferation interests that we have. Economic interests. There are more than 300 American companies that have significant investment, including one of the CEOs who's in this room right now. Significant investment in Russia. How are we going to keep that engagement and keep it positive going forward? And that, to me, is a question I have yet to come up with a solution.
Thank you.
Okay, so how could you assemble anything better than that? We all are grateful for this kind of thing. With keeping our time moving along, as you ask questions, would you please direct them not to the panel, but to somebody in the panel, just in the interest of time and letting people get as many questions out as they like. Who goes first? Yeah, Sheldon.
Question for me. Meade, in some of the earlier instructions you've arranged for me, I think it was said that the lines among these various former Soviet republics were drawn by the most famous Georgian of all, Joseph Stalin. And my question to you is, was this line, this northern border of Georgia, drawn by Stalin? And if so, was it the historical line between Georgia and Russia? In other words, where were the accessions historically?
The northern border of Georgia was where it's always been. And the South Ossetian state, which was created by the Bolshevik government, was the new creation to separate the Ossetians from the Georgians. So the traditional border has been the tunnel, the rocky tunnel that leads into North Ossetia. That goes back hundreds of years.
I think it's important to note, if I may just add to that, as you probably read, but it really is important in that question about what Joseph Stalin did. He, of course, was from Gori. He is just a baseball throw from this, and of course some of the military action actually took place in Gori. Stalin understood, as both early in his career after he was a seminarian, he became a bandit. He understood the dynamics of this area, and he knew the threat of this area and why it was important to separate these people in terms of the control of the area. He was quite knowledgeable, and I think we owe him something for where we are today because of his actions in this regard.
By the way, the long history is what you just said. We won't get into it now, but the rest of Sela, those countries, Stalin got the map where he took his crayon and drew lines that did just that, kind of valley and those areas there. Peter.
Wayne, just a question for you.
Yes, sir.
It's also interesting that Russia has significant holdings in gender securities.
Yes.
But more about the twice. The question for you is, does this all accelerate Turkey's accession to the EU or position?
Well, I think I'm not an expert on that, but the question was, will this conflict accelerate Turkey's accession to the EU? It certainly will add stimulus to those people who are concerned about this region, and I think that's clear. But the Turkish situation, as you know, is not it's a complicated one, and there are a lot of elements involved in that. But suffice it to say that the EU question and the NATO question are really important here. These are entities that are about economic security, they're about political unity, they're about national and international security systems, and these arrangements are historic and historical. But I think they're all in play here, and it's a good question of what's the impact, what's the fallout of this going to be. As we always say about Americans versus Russia, or at least I've said it over the last decades, you know, Americans tend to play cards. We think strategically in like we play cards, poker. You know, you have your hand, you play it, that's it. Russians, of course, are chess players, and we'll see how this all plays out from their side, but also from the Western and the international point of view, especially with respect to EU.
General Poitras, could I ask you to comment on the conduct of the two armies or the two armed forces? Given your role in training the Georgians, I don't want to push too deep, but was discretion the better part of valor in that they withdrew hastily, or was there a true failure of any attempt to stand up to the Russians, particularly within Georgia itself? And secondly, what lessons did we learn about the Russian army? And then perhaps thirdly, what is going to be the role of the U.S. going forward in terms of re-equipping or retraining the Georgian army?
I think you've asked a very legitimate question. I believe, in my personal judgment, is that the Georgians were very wise not to try to fight to the finish. That they clearly could not win that. I don't think anybody, least of all the Georgians, have ever speculated that they could stand up to the Russians, ever. The point of the Georgians having a military is not to defeat the Russians or to keep the Russians out. It's to get into NATO, which means that the United States and the rest of Europe are there to keep the Russians out. So I think, as Neve pointed out, I think this really is all about NATO. And to a lesser extent, it is about the missile defense shield in Poland. That's really what it's about. We're dealing with a resurgent Russia who has made it clear they do not want those things to happen. They did not want Kosovo to happen. They're still chafing about that. And they picked this time and place to flex their muscle. I think, again, I would reiterate my question. Strategically, does it make sense for them to flex their muscle here and now? I think probably not. I think this was probably a strategically counterproductive move on the part of the Russians. The second question there, again, I don't think we know the answer. My understanding is that Saakashvili has made requests for major U.S. military assistance militarily. The president pledged $1 billion the other day, $500 million cash up front almost immediately. How much of that will be military hardware, I think, is still an open question. But to give my opinion, I don't think there's any question the United States will aggressively re-engage with the Georgians to rebuild their military.
I was at a conference 2 weeks ago when Ambassador Holbrooke had just come back from Tbilisi, and I understand he and Senator Biden were one of the first Americans into Georgia afterwards, and he commented that Mikhail Saakashvili was not even in Georgia when this happened. He was actually on vacation. And I think if that's in fact the case, and it came from a very reliable source, we're dealing with a very unreliable person. That's an observation, and I'm asked either Mr. Law yourself, General Prefect, if you happen to know and have confirmation of that. And the second is a question that I would suggest, further to what Cedric Sussman said, the biggest impact is on what happens in the Crimea. Because the largest outstanding issue is access to the Black Sea and the Crimea. And 80% of the people in Crimea are Russian and have Russian passports, and that's the most depressed part of the Ukraine. That's where the next action is. I appreciate comment.
I can't speak to where he was when hostilities broke out, but clearly he is a mercurial personality. Very excitable, very nationalistic, some would say unpredictable. And I agree with your latter point about the Crimea and Ukraine generally. When I said it's about NATO, it's not just Georgia NATO, it's about Ukraine NATO as well. I think the message here is to the Baltic states, to Poland, to the Czech Republic, to the Ukraine and to Georgia, we're back. I mean, that's the message on all of these fronts, whether it's missile defense, whether it's NATO membership, whether it's energy security, whatever it is, Russia is now back. That's their message.
And that is certainly what played out on the television in Moscow, and you've seen in the press. But it was every day. The speeches were there. Is that this reestablishes the Russia position and this is why the response in those places like Ukraine, the people there's a lot of concern because the Russians, in that sense, they would consider, the Russians would consider it actually a geostrategic and a political victory, irrespective of the isolation, because they've made this statement and they're going to get the attention of the people who surround the country and, they hope, of the West.
The use of the term privileged interest by lawyers is kind of interesting. I'm wondering what you interpret that to mean.
Well, I took it on face value. I'm married to one, but I'm happily not a lawyer myself. It's actually, I think it is about. The Russians have always talked about privileged interest, special interest. I'm not sure. I don't know how to parse the word specifically, but it is I think from their point of view, the interests, when they talk about them, it's about what they perceive to be in their core national interests. What this is a reassertion is that they are saying we have rights here. In that sense, it probably is a legal term. He's talking about we have rights that are inherent and that we can exercise when we will.
It's basically a Monroe Doctrine for Russia, if you get right.
Very, very good.
Are they using that as a ruse for the whole energy resources that are here? Is that really the target?
Well, they've certainly been interested in whatever leverage they can use across all of Central Asia and all the way everywhere they can in terms of influencing and getting control of those energy resources. That is a national policy that Mr. Putin articulated in the late 80s and is continuing to implement. If you look at that, and there is the map. As Marshall Goldman, who is a Harvard scholar, a Wellesley scholar on Russia for many years, an economist, just wrote a book on petrostate. I mean, it is the map of the gas and oil pipelines that tell you the story. They want to dominate this and, by extension, get involved in investment around the world that will put them in a very, very strong position with respect to energy and strategic metals. And as you know, they're making moves all over the place, including the United States, in investment in a variety of industries related to energy and metals. As some people call Russia now, the big Russian oil company, of course, is Gazprom, and it's now Gazpromistan.
Pat Buchanan, in a recent column headlined, "Did the United States start the Second Cold War?" Could you comment?
I assume you look at me. I assume you're addressing it to me. I don't know that I subscribe to that. I mean, clearly, the United States has strategic interests. Clearly, we have a strategic interest in not just Middle Eastern oil, but Caspian oil as well. We have an interest in a somewhat more theoretical interest in seeing if not a democratic regimes around the world, at least just regimes based on the rule of law. And based on those interests, we have certainly asserted our interest in Georgia and other places there, and the Russians have reacted. I don't know that I see that as the beginning of a new Cold War. As I think Joel pointed out, there are more things. We have more things in common with the Russians than we have to fight about.
It'd be interesting if we had time, or reassemble sometime to just talk about. We don't bring China into this, but they're there.
Right.
Question.
Same question. Is this the beginning of the Cold War?
I don't think so. I think that the short-term reaction, one of the issues that really bothers me is that all of the reactions have been about 20 minutes into the future, and that there's not been much strategy on the part of the Europeans. The Javier Solana statement in 2006 about what would happen based on Kosovo, and that if we let it become short-term in a battle of egos, then I think there is a real issue here. And Putin is clearly susceptible to that. So is our outgoing president. So I think we do have some issues there. I think the Europeans have, one of the positive things, the Europeans have awakened to the fact that security is still an issue. And so the long-term security, Europeans tend to think longer term, and I think that will help balance this to a longer-term situation. I think that we're and this is not a political statement about parties, we're at a very good time to be changing presidents one way or the other in 3 months. Because I think that will allow a fresh start in all of this, in our strategic partners, and start retrading the deal with Russia and Europe and the others, which has to happen.
Number of months ago, on March 27th, the Southern Center hosted 5 secretaries of state, former secretaries of state representing both parties. Long before this conflict got underway, at least in the armed conflict, 5 of them agreed that whatever it takes, engaging with the Russians on a wide variety of important global issues is essential for the future of our republic. And they stated that this was everybody from Henry Kissinger to Madeleine Albright, Colin Powell, Jim Baker, and Warren Christopher. Across the board, they agreed that that was important, and the reconstitution and the establishment of the art of statecraft, the not irrational or without conditions in engagement, but certainly to keep the dialogue going in order to prevent this. They thought, and before this conflict, and I think, a Cold War is quite possible, or at least a very hostile period if we don't, on all sides, be creative as we move forward, because there's a lot at stake everywhere, and the volatile flashpoints are so numerous and so hot that things could happen and get out of hand. The final note is what Mr. Gates said, and Secretary Gates said so admirably, which is we must not respond tactically only to the situation that we're faced with, but be looking strategically at the longer term.
Joel, man, just
Last question.
Is the political hubris and intoxication caused by the oil and gas stream of wealth blind Putin to the longer-term consequences of this action? And is the question of the United States and the European Union allowing them to maybe come to their senses?
Well, we would hope that would be the result of this. I'll at least say that the question was that Mr. Putin's recent oil wealth and the oil wealth of the country maybe create an atmosphere in which he thinks he's invincible or has more power than he really has. I think there is something to that. Certainly their rise to power, re-rise to power, re-emergence has been spectacular based on those natural resources and their sale of them and the price of oil around the world. And certainly it gave him what he believed was his ability to get out in the world and take these new steps. I think it is a factor.
Yeah, don't underestimate the fact, though, it's a failed country. If it weren't for extraction, they have nothing. You buy nothing from Russia except extracted materials. They've got an alcoholic population. Their education system is rapidly going to hell. And so it's basically a failed state with an oil surplus.
Okay, on that note, I would like to take a minute to ask General Porthos to introduce. You've seen a few people in uniform here. Some are not in uniform, but there are people we owe a big debt to.
Point of personal privilege. Thank you, Joel. I'd just like to introduce, they're not my people anymore, but the Guard people who are here today. These are people who have lived and worked in the Republic of Georgia diligently in those vineyards, quite literally, for about 15 years, including David Papava, who is a member of our Guard, but he's also a Georgia national. So if you all raise your hand, let's recognize him.
Okay, thanks to all of you, and thanks to the panel, and good day.
I enjoyed it.